joining us this hour. Right up until just moments ago, I thought we were going to be joined tonight, live, right about now on this program, by one of the lawyers who is representing Christine Blasey Ford, the California woman who has come forward with this very serious allegation that Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh attempted to rape her when he was 17 years old and going to a prep school in suburban Maryland. It is still unclear as to how the Senate is going to handle that allegation and if there's going to be any impartial investigation whatsoever of Dr. Ford's claims. At the time that we booked Dr. Ford's attorney to be on the show tonight, it really looked like Dr. Ford's lawyers and the Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee might be on track to negotiate some sort of mutually agreeable terms under which Dr. Ford would appear in some way before that committee to discuss her allegation. The fact that those negotiations were underway tonight is publicly known. The written communication from Dr. Ford's lawyers to the committee, which sort of started off those negotiations today, that statement is also publicly known. I'll share that with you in just a second. As of tonight, heading into airtime tonight, we thought those negotiations were far enough along that Dr. Ford's lawyer would be able to join us live to tell us tonight right here what was going to happen. But no, it sort of fell apart at the last moment. Now, they were very nice about it. I'm not mad. My feelings are not hurt. But the reason they gave us for canceling sort of at the last minute tonight may itself be news. Dr. Ford's legal team telling us tonight that they couldn't be on the show, and they cited, quote, active efforts to reach the committee as their reason why Dr. Ford's lawyer couldn't appear with us live. So we infer from that these negotiations were continuing into this evening. And for some reason, Dr. Ford's lawyers believed it might have impeded the prospects for them coming to some sort of negotiated conclusion for them to do any live interviews at this moment while these negotiations are underway. So here's basically the status as far as we know it. Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement months ago. The vacancy on the Supreme Court created by his retirement has been there for more than 70 days. The Supreme Court is not in session at this point. We know there is no special freshness date after which a Supreme Court vacancy goes bad and starts to stink up the fridge. We know that because Republicans held open a vacancy on the Supreme Court for nearly a year, rather than allow President Barack Obama to have his nominee considered to fill the seat that was vacated by Justice Antonin Scalia after Scalia died in the winter of 2016. So given that, we know there is no external constraint here. There is no ticking time bomb that is going to go off if the Brett Kavanaugh nomination process is slowed down to allow for the consideration of this new serious allegation against him. We know that in part because of the Antonin Scalia, Merrick Garland example, where they held that seat open forever. But we also know that because today there was no vote on Judge Brett Kavanaugh in the Senate Judiciary Committee. They were planning on voting today. They didn't vote today. So the Kavanaugh nomination process is already delayed as of today. Today, there was no vote, right? Kavanaugh nomination process is already delayed. How long it will be delayed while this allegation is considered is something for which there are no external rules. There is no set time frame. They can take as much time or as little time as they want to make sure they have thoroughly considered this nominee and what it would mean to put him on the Supreme Court for the rest of his natural life. But despite that fact, despite the fact that they really can take all the time they want, the committee chairman, Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, has informed the lawyers for Christine Blasey Ford that she has a deadline. She has a deadline of 10 a.m. Eastern time tomorrow, by which time she must inform the committee whether or not she intends to testify on Monday. And the Republicans thus far have been saying, that's it. That's her only chance. It's Monday or nothing. And she has to commit by tomorrow morning as to whether or not she's going to be there on Monday, and that's it. That's her only chance. Time's up. It's over. Because of this sort of imaginary external imperative that they must hustle through this on a time frame they have newly imagined this week, that's what they've been demanding of her. That's it. That's your only chance. Deadline's tomorrow morning. Well, as we reported last night, the main sticking point appears to be whether or not Republicans in the Senate and the White House will allow the normal procedure that is usually followed in cases like this to apply to this case too. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh is not the first nominee for the Supreme Court or the first nominee for any other high-ranking Senate-confirmed position who has gone through the process of confirmation hearings only to see a serious allegation of some personal nature raised against him by a member of the public late in the process. That has happened to other nominees before. There's a system for dealing with this. That, of course, is what happened to Judge Clarence Thomas after his confirmation hearings were concluded in 1991, and then law professor Anita Hill came forward with serious allegations of sexual harassment against him. Our friend Steve Schmidt from the George W. Bush White House and the John McCain campaign reminded us today that a similar dynamic was at play when George H.W. Bush nominated Senator John Tower to be Secretary of Defense. Deep into John Tower's nominating process, serious allegations came forward about Tower's personal life, including infidelity and particularly allegations about excessive drinking. In both the Clarence Thomas case and the John Tower case, it was an absolutely mundane, non-controversial part of those controversies that when late allegations emerged about those nominees, as part of the FBI's standard role in doing background investigations on nominees, in both of those cases, the FBI reopened those background investigations and looked into these new allegations when those new allegations arose during the confirmation process. The FBI part of it is not a high-profile part of the history of those controversies, right? If you ever take a class where you study the controversial nomination of Clarence Thomas or the controversial and ultimately failed nomination of John Tower, if you ever study those matters, the FBI looking into the allegations won't come up in class because it's such a mundane, normal part of the process. It's not even remarked upon in those controversies. But when the history of the Brett Kavanaugh nomination is someday told, the thing that will stand out on this one, like a 10-foot tall hat on a knee-high horse, is that for some reason with this one, Republicans in the Senate and the Trump White House couldn't even explain the reasons why they absolutely insisted the FBI must not be allowed to do that in this case. The FBI must not be allowed to reopen and complete their background investigation on Brett Kavanaugh to account for this new allegation. That would be regular order. That's the way that it always goes whenever there's a controversy that arises during the confirmation process. FBI reopens its background investigation process, accounts for these new allegations, reports on what they find. It's factored into the confirmation process. That is a normal part of the process. Republicans in the White House insist that that cannot be part of the process this time. Why not? Well, tonight, Christine Blasey Ford's legal team is apparently negotiating with the Senate Judiciary Committee about the terms under which Dr. Ford might testify about this allegation. In her legal team's letter to the Judiciary Committee, her attorneys told Chairman Grassley today that there really ought to be an investigation of her claims before she sits down with senators. Quote, her strong preference continues to be for the Senate Judiciary Committee to allow for a full investigation prior to her testimony. Now, a statement released moments ago by Senator Chuck Grassley confirms that discussions have been taking place, but so far no announcement as to what they have decided. I have to say, just as an observer of this process, I would like to hear a reason from the Republican-controlled Senate Judiciary Committee as to why they are insisting that the FBI shouldn't look into this, why they are insisting that the normal procedure for dealing with this shouldn't apply in this case. They really haven't even made an argument for why they want this departure from normal order for Kavanaugh specifically. But here's what else Dr. Ford's lawyer said to Senator Grassley tonight. Quote, as you are aware, she has been receiving death threats, which have been reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And she and her family have been forced out of their home. She wishes to testify, provided that we can agree on terms that are fair and which ensure her safety. A hearing on Monday is not possible, and the committee's insistence that it occur then is arbitrary in any event. So, we don't know how these negotiations are ultimately going to land. If we get a call while we're on the air this hour, I will let you know as soon as we know. But as far as we can tell, the bottom line here is that her attorneys are saying Monday is impossible. Some other day next week might be possible. They want terms that they believe are fair and that, quote, ensure her safety. We're not exactly sure what that might mean, what kind of assurances they might be looking for there. But also, again, Dr. Ford is expressing her, quote, strong preference that there be a full investigation prior to her testimony. Now, how could that full investigation happen? They don't want the FBI to do it for some reason. They won't say why they don't want the FBI to do it, but they won't let the FBI do it, even though that's what would normally happen. I don't know if that's still tenable, if that's still going to hold, but that still seems to be what they're insisting on. Senator Grassley, chairman of the committee, has insisted that, you know what, his own staff can do the whole investigation and that'll be fine. That's good enough. A couple of problems have emerged with that approach over the past day or so. Number one, it's clear from the letter from Dr. Ford's attorneys that Dr. Ford and her attorneys don't consider Chuck Grassley's own staff looking into it to necessarily count as a full and impartial investigation. Also, members of Chuck Grassley's committee seem to have a problem with this idea from their chairman. You might remember that this is how Chairman Grassley announced that his own staff was taking care of it. He said online, quote, no other outside investigation is necessary for the committee to do its investigation. Committee investigators are following up on leads from Dr. Ford's allegations and news stories. Committee investigators are following up on leads. Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island is on that committee. He responded to that from Chuck Grassley, quote, really? When? Who will locate and interview witnesses? Has the Judiciary Committee hired independent investigators that we don't know about? When will the witness statements be taken? When will they be shared? Will the minority get to call the witnesses, or will that just be the Republicans who get to call witnesses? Senator Grassley has also run into a problem in the form of his top staffer on the committee, the person who he has apparently tasked with investigating this attempted rape allegation. The investigator is named Mike Davis. He says that he is the chief counsel for nominations working for Chairman Chuck Grassley on the Judiciary Committee. Last night, Mr. Davis decided for some reason to get on Twitter and let it all hang out in terms of how this supposed investigation is going. He said online, quote, I personally question Judge Kavanaugh under penalty of felony and 5 years of imprisonment if he lies. I'm still waiting to hear back from the accuser's attorneys. Which means by his own description, he's the guy who is personally conducting the investigation of this matter. When Chuck Grassley says that the committee investigators are following up on leads and doing these, apparently who he's talking about is Mike Davis. I personally question Judge Kavanaugh. I am waiting to hear back from the accuser's attorneys. The very next tweet in Mike Davis's timeline, also from last night, is this one. Unfazed and determined, period. We will confirm Judge Kavanaugh. Hashtag confirm Kavanaugh. Hashtag SCOTUS. Okay, so you can see the problem. If this is the lead investigator that Chuck Grassley has put on this matter, this guy who is hashtag confirm Kavanaugh all the way, right? Already proclaiming himself to be unfazed by this little problem that's arisen in the confirmation process. Right? And there's Chuck Grassley saying no other outside investigation is necessary because his committee investigators are taking this on and nobody should have any reason to doubt their impartiality or whether they have an open mind on these matters. Hashtag confirm Kavanaugh. After posting his unfazed and determined hashtag confirm Kavanaugh tweet last night, Chairman Grassley's chief investigator, Mike Davis, deleted those tweets and he locked his Twitter account. So there's no explanation still from the White House or from Republicans in the Senate as to why they will not let the FBI include this matter, this serious allegation against Judge Kavanaugh in their Kavanaugh background check, which would be standard procedure. Obviously now there are seemingly untenable problems with Chuck Grassley insisting that he and his staff can look into this himself. It would be a totally unbiased look. Why would you think they're biased? Hashtag confirm Kavanaugh. Unfazed, determined. We believe that negotiations continued into this evening. As to whether or not there will be any investigation of this matter and the question of whether there will be testimony by Dr. Ford on this issue, this is a totally live concern. This is unsettled. We really do not know how this is going to go, either in terms of whether or not Kavanaugh is going to be withdrawn from consideration. Whether he will be confirmed, if indeed they go forward with it, we don't even know what's going to happen in terms of the next steps of how this element of his confirmation process is going to be handled. It is totally open. Anything could happen here. Given that, I want to leave you with 3 little points that you might not have seen in the news today, even if you were following this closely, but you should know if you are trying to figure out where this is going to go next. I should also tell you that in just a moment, we're going to be live with Senator Pat Leahy, who's one of the most senior Democrats on this committee. He was there during the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas controversy. He's helping to lead the Democratic side of this fight right now. I'm going to put just 3 little pins in this map, and then we're going to bring in Senator Leahy. So number 1. First thing you should know is that the New York Times reports tonight, and NBC News later reported tonight, that on the Republican side, they have apparently decided they're going to hire an outside lawyer, an outside counsel, not to investigate this allegation, but rather to perform the questioning of Dr. Ford, if she does ever end up testifying on this matter before their committee. This means Republican senators themselves don't want to be seen on TV asking questions of this witness. They are apparently engaging, and they are apparently going to pay an outside lawyer to question her for them. Even as they are unwilling to allow the FBI to investigate this matter or to appoint an outside counsel to investigate this matter as a factual basis, they're still going to appoint an outside counsel just to do their questioning so they don't have to do it. That's one thing you should know. Second thing you should know, and this is not directly materially relevant to how this controversy is going to unfold, but I think it's very politically relevant. NBC News has just published new polling data on Kavanaugh's nomination. The first time they polled on Kavanaugh was in July. And in July, Kavanaugh had historically low levels of support in the NBC poll. The raw numbers were 32% of Americans wanted to confirm him, 26% did not. It's sort of easiest, I think, just to look at the total, the right column there, right? 32% in support, 26% not supporting him. That means he was +6 in terms of the difference between the number of people who wanted him on the court and the number of people who did not want him on the court. +6 is really, really, really low for a Supreme Court nominee. That was July. Then the next month, in August, NBC did the exact same poll, and his support actually dropped a little bit. He went from +6 in July down to +4 in August. Well, now NBC Tonight has just unveiled new polling that's been in the field since this serious allegation was made against Brett Kavanaugh by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And support for him, already historically low by just, +6, +4, support for him now has fallen off the cliff. His support now is at -4. By a 4-point margin, more Americans want him not on the court than want him confirmed. And every poll's a little different. You want to make sure you compare apples to apples when you're comparing polls and seeing the way they change over time. But this is an apples to apples comparison. He's gone from +6 to +4 to -4. And in the history of the NBC poll on Supreme Court nominees, no nominee has ever had negative support before. Ever. But Brett Kavanaugh does, by a good margin. So if the White House is deciding whether or not they're going to abandon this nomination, if Republican senators are deciding whether or not they really want to go out on a limb for this particular nominee at this particular moment, those kinds of terrible, in fact, unprecedentedly terrible polling numbers for Kavanaugh suggest that that kind of calculation might not work in his favor. So you should know that too. And I just want to make one last point here. The allegation that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has made against Brett Kavanaugh is a serious allegation, right? She is alleging that he attempted to rape her. Attempted rape is a felony. And even though we are in this weird twilight zone where Republicans and the White House insist that the FBI should not be allowed to look into this as part of Brett Kavanaugh's background investigation, without even explaining why they are insisting on that, there is also a live question as to whether or not this could be pursued as a criminal matter. There's no statute of limitations for a felony like this in Maryland. This alleged assault is said to have happened in Montgomery County, Maryland. Local authorities in Montgomery County, Maryland now say that while this allegation does pertain to their jurisdiction, the reason they have not yet opened a criminal investigation of this matter is because they have not received a criminal complaint from the alleged victim in this case. I don't know if it will always be that way. Whether or not the White House and Senate Republicans ever get it together to allow the FBI to look into this matter before they try to vote on Kavanaugh as a Supreme Court nominee, even if they did vote on him, and confirm him to the court and he became a sitting Supreme Court justice, there would remain the possibility indefinitely, if Dr. Ford ever wanted to pursue it this way, that she could at any point make that criminal complaint to the police in Maryland, who would not be bound by some expiration of the statute of limitations here. Such a complaint could start a criminal investigation, conceivably of a sitting Supreme Court justice, for felony attempted rape. If law enforcement found that allegation to be substantiated and they found sufficient evidence to bring charges, there is no rule against indicting a Supreme Court justice. There is not even Justice Department policy against indicting a Supreme Court justice the way there is for, say, a president of the United States. And wouldn't that be great for the court? Senator Patrick Leahy joins us live next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.